Welcome to another webinar by REACHLaw, this time on CBAM, and it's part 2 of the basics of the carbon border adjustment mechanism webinar series we are having. And today we're going to focus on the implications according to your role in the supply chain. So going into more of the practicalities of CBAM and how it will affect you. So, as mentioned, this is part 2 of a 2-part webinar series. We had our first webinar just a few weeks ago, March 21st, on the basics, the dire basics. And today, I said, it's part 2 on April 16th. Part 1 you can find on YouTube under our channel called REACHLaw Talks. I'll come back to that in a few slides. And also this part 2 will be there within some days for you to view again if you want. Okay, so today we have 2 presenters, as of Tero being the subject matter expert, and I'm Frederik Johanson. I'm just here to moderate and answer questions and so forth as far as I can. But Tero is the subject matter expert. And Tero, please, if you can introduce yourself, please, shortly.
Thank you, Frederik. Hello, everyone. So my name is Tero Koski, and I'm a principal consultant here at REACHLaw, focusing on economic, social, and environmental impact assessments. I'm an economist by training, and I have 10 years experience from regulatory compliance.
Thank you, Tero. And I'm Frederik Johanson, partner, head of sales at REACHLaw. Yeah, been working with chemical regulations and EHS topics for 20 years this year, actually. So time flies when you're having fun, I think. Anyway, let's go forward. So just some practical information regarding the webinar. So as before, the questions you submitted beforehand as part of the registration process, we'll answer that during the Q&A session. But you can also submit additional questions using the chat function, and we'll try to cover those as best we can also during the Q&A session. And as mentioned, we also have we're going to upload this webinar, as well as, of course, the part 1 was already uploaded to our REACHLaw Talks YouTube channel. So if you go into YouTube and just type in REACHLaw Talks in the search field, you will find our channel and these webinars there also. And also feel free to send us feedback. We appreciate that very much. And also if you think something should be better, different, and so forth, or if you have ideas for webinars, please feel free also to send those to us. We appreciate that very much. Okay, so today it'll be a fairly busy agenda on CBAM, so we'll just go through the just a quick introduction to REACHLaw. I'll do that, and then hand over to Tero, who will go into the CBAM, provide you an overview, just the CBAM in brief, and then go into authorities and technical roles and their obligations and how to comply depending on your role in the supply chain. So the crux, I think, of this webinar session. Then before that, after that, I mean, we will go to the conclusions and then to the Q&As at the end. And you'll, of course, find our contact details at the end. And this webinar should take around 45 minutes or so, less than an hour for sure. Okay, just the quick REACHLaw in brief for those of you who have not seen us before, heard of us before. So what we do is we focus on providing services for REACH and REACH-like chemical regulations for the most part. CBAM is not quite chemical regulations, but that is something we are also expanding our expertise on. But looking at our focus, so we do provide mostly, let's say, the services pertaining to these chemical regulations, REACH-like chemical regulations, such as EU REACH, obviously, where everything started, and UK REACH, K REACH in Seoul, where we have our newest office subsidiary providing carriage services such as only representation and so forth. And then of course in Turkey, where we have providing, for example, Turkey KKD AK related services, so Turkey Reach related services. But also in India, in New Delhi, we have an office whereby we provide services, for example, on India BIS, which is quite a complicated regulation if you are within that scope. We have separate webinars and information on our website on that, so we'll not go into details here. And then we also have a very small office in Belgium, in Brussels, and the head office, of course, being in Helsinki, Finland, where I'm not at the moment. So we do provide a full suite of services pertaining to chemical market access, but also sustainability and now CBAM related services. Come back to that in the next slide. So we do everything from providing only representative services for if you want to place chemical substances on these markets we looked at. We provide these services through our subsidiaries in those locations. So we can do everything from the basic registration to the more demanding lead registrations and authorizations and so forth. And also providing related consultancy and training if need be. I will not go into details here as we are focusing on slightly different subject today, which is of course CBAM. For CBAM services, we provide scoping studies, readiness assessment, impact assessments pertaining to environmental and financial scopes thereof, and of course when CBAM enters into force in earnest, then of course reporting related services, and of course all things related to like consulting services and training and so forth for other subjects maybe not covered in this slide. So full set of services as at this stage of the CBAM implementation. And as mentioned, we do have our own YouTube channel called REACHLaw Talks, so please head over there. You will find a lot of information and videos. I think we have 53 or 54 videos already uploaded where you will find many of these topics covered and uploaded into YouTube. So our former webinars and so forth. And as mentioned, also the CBAM Part 1 webinar is already uploaded, and this one, the Part 2, will be uploaded within some days. So feel free to head over there and have a look, and if you like, subscribe, and of course you'll feel free to also give a thumbs up if you fancy any of the content there. Thank you. And if you are the traveling kind, and if you are the one who are going to different events and expos around the world, you will be able to find us in these different events. There are a few ones who already we've attended, so those are in the past, like Helsinki Chemical Forum and the India Rubber Expo. But the next one coming up is Chem Expo in India later this month. That we will be there. Chem UK here in Birmingham, not here, but in the UK, in Birmingham. I'm in the UK at the moment, that's why I'm saying here. I will be there, for example, and colleagues from the UK office, and then of course ChemCon Asia in Bangkok. Yours truly will also be there with colleagues from our office in Korea, and then ChemSpec Europe in Germany. That is also a place where you will find REACHLaw, and again yours truly. And later on in the year, Turkchem in Turkey, in Istanbul, where we will also be presenting. So if you are in any of these locations, please come and find us, and we'll love to have a chat with you, of course, on any and all topics related to our expertise and what you need. And the final slide before giving the floor to Tero, of course, the normal disclaimer and copyright. So of course, all the material you find in this presentation, of course, if you take actions based on this presentation, then it's on your own responsibility. This is not a substitute for proper consultants or consultancy or expert advice. So it's on your own responsibility. So I'll just leave it at that. Feel free to look at this in detail if you like. And with that, Tero, please take over, and I'll just terminate the camera feed so that we can dedicate the full stream to the content and not have any network issues as we go along. So Tero, please tell me when to change slides, and you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Frederik. So first I will explain CBAM in brief. Next slide, please. So before starting, I want to note that some of today's topics were already presented last time. Today, maybe from a bit different angle. Anyway, repetition is the mother of learning, so it should be okay for everyone. And all right, let's start then. What CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanism, is? It is a regulatory measure adopted by the European Union as part of its ambition to fight climate change and reach climate neutrality by 2050. It's an environmental policy measure which complements and reinforces the existing carbon pricing mechanism in the EU emission trading system. It addresses the phenomenon known as carbon leakage, which corresponds to the risk that carbon cost could lead businesses to move their operations to countries with less stringent carbon pricing mechanism. It encourages sustainable practices to reduce carbon footprint globally. And CBAM is now in so-called transitional phase. Definitive period starts in 2026. Next slide, please. Here, for a reminder, as of now, CBAM applies to 6 sectors, which are cement, electricity, fertilizers, iron and steel, aluminum, and hydrogen. These sectors are considered carbon intensive due to the significant greenhouse gas emissions associated with their production processes, the risk of carbon leakage, and the practical visibility. The sectors are key sectors in the modern society. Cement is a key building material used in construction. Electricity is vital for various industries and daily life. Fertilizers are essential for agriculture. Iron and steel are used in construction, manufacturing, and infrastructure. Aluminum is used in automotive, aerospace, and construction industries. And hydrogen is used as an energy storage and fuel source in various industries. Next slide, please. On this slide, we recall the scope of the CBAM. The CBAM regulation applies only to CBAM goods originating in third countries and imported into the customs territory of the Union, marked with darker green on the slide. In principle, imports of goods from all non-EU countries are covered by the CBAM. However, certain third countries who participate in the EU ETS or have an emission trading system linked to it are excluded from the CBAM. These countries are the EFTA countries, Iceland, Norway, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland. These are marked with lighter green on the slide. Certain CN-coded goods from the CBAM sectors presented on the previous slide fall under the scope of the regulation. CN codes of these so-called CBAM goods are given in the Annex 1 to the CBAM regulation. And when a CBAM good enters the territory, a CBAM certificate corresponding to the goods embedded emission is purchased by the importer. And this balances the carbon cost between a non-EU and EU production, as the certificate corresponds to the carbon price in the EU emission trading system. The CBAM will therefore help reduce the risk of carbon leakage while encouraging producers in non-EU countries to green their production processes and also other countries to introduce carbon pricing measures. Next slide, please. This slide gives a short introduction on how CBAM works in the UK. There are two approaches depending on where the company is located and where it is importing. Let's start with the EU perspective, which mainly concerns the producers in the UK. From the EU perspective, the UK is considered a third country, and therefore embedded emissions from CBAM goods originated from the UK and imported in the EU will need to be reported during the transitional period. In the definitive period, if a UK producer has already paid a carbon price on the embedded emissions for the production of the imported goods in the UK ETS, the corresponding cost can be fully deducted from the CBAM obligation when imported in the EU. Next, the UK perspective, which concerns mainly the UK-based importers of CBAM goods, companies who import CBAM goods in the UK. The UK will introduce its own CBAM starting from January 1st, 2027. It is proposed that the first accounting period will run for 12 months and cover imports of CBAM goods from 1st of January to 31st of December 2027. From 2028, accounting periods will become quarterly. For the first accounting period, extra time is given for liable persons to set up processes to obtain information from their suppliers about the carbon content of the imported goods. Therefore, the standard rules are relaxed and extra time is given until the end of May 2028, when CBAM also becomes payable. Later, returns are submitted within 1 month after the end of the accounting period. The initial period of the UK CBAM is from 2027 to 2030, and it is to be reviewed and possibly modified after this period. There are some differences in affected sectors between the UK and the EU CBAM. Otherwise, they are similar, but ceramics and glass fall under the scope, and electricity is excluded from the scope of the UK CBAM. Compared to the EU CBAM, also the liability is a bit different. In the EU, it is based on the purchase and surrender of CBAM certificates at the current ETS market price. In the UK, however, this model is seen too complex, as it would require additional new administrative steps for UK importers and the government through the sale and purchase of the certificates. The UK's model is like a self-assessment tax model where the liable person will need to submit a return containing the relevant information. Based on this submission, the CBAM liability will be calculated by multiplying the embodied emissions by the effective UK carbon price minus the overseas carbon price. Next slide, please. Next, on to the timeline of the CBAM implementation with the most important milestones. The transitional phase started in October last year and will last until the end of 2025. During this period, CBAM focuses on monitoring and reporting. It doesn't involve any financial adjustment or the need to purchase CBAM certificates. Importers of CBAM goods or their customs representatives need to submit a quarterly CBAM report, outlining the embedded emissions associated with goods imported, as well as any carbon pricing due. The full implementation will begin from 1st of January 2026. From this point, authorized CBAM declarants will be required to purchase CBAM certificates corresponding to the embedded emissions. From 26 to 33, the embedded emissions for CBAM goods will gradually be covered by the CBAM obligation, as free allocation under the EU ETS is gradually phased out. By the end of 2025, the Commission will review the transitional period, and by 2030, look into the possibility of extending CBAM to other goods and sectors covered by the EU ETS at risk of carbon leakage. These sectors are expected to be chemicals, polymers, paper and pulp, and mineral oil product sectors. During the definitive period, EU operators will pay the CO2 price of their emissions and surrender allowances under the EU ETS. And EU importers will surrender CBAM certificates that closely reflect the situation of the EU ETS. From 2034, CBAM is fully operational. 100% of embedded emissions of the CBAM goods will be covered by CBAM certificates, and no free allocation will be given under the EU ETS for these goods. Also then, all ETS products should be covered by CBAM. Financial obligations for EU operators and importers continue under EU ETS or CBAM. Next slide, please. And how EU emission trading system and CBAM are connected. This slide simplifies how they are working together to prevent the carbon leakage. Once CBAM is fully in place, together with EU ETS, it equals the carbon-related production cost between the EU and outside the EU. The cost related to the emissions of products produced in the non-EU countries will be comparable to those incurred within the EU. And manufacturers and importers will be equally accountable for their carbon footprint. EU ETS will cover the production in the EU, as the EU producer must purchase and surrender emission allowances from the EU ETS. And CBAM will cover the production outside the EU. EU importers will buy CBAM certificates corresponding to the carbon price that would have been paid had the goods been produced under the EU's carbon pricing rules. In other words, CBAM creates level playing field for EU and non-EU producers. Next slide, please. Next, I will explain which emissions are covered in the embedded emissions under CBAM. This topic was presented in the last webinar, but it is revisited now because it is connected with the EU methodology, which will be presented on the next slide. Let's start with an installation outside of the EU who is producing a CBAM good. Direct emissions refer to the greenhouse gas emissions released directly during the production at the installation level. These can be produced, for example, from the combustion of fuels and calcination process. Under CBAM, direct emissions also include emissions from the production of the heating and cooling, irrespective of the location where they are produced. For example, emissions related to steam produced in another installation that is then delivered to a cement plant qualify as direct emissions. Indirect emissions. CBAM requires the emissions resulting from the electricity consumed during the manufacturing process to be monitored and accounted for. This includes CO2 emission associated with the production of electricity, such as from power plants. The last part is so-called precursor emissions. There are two types of CBAM goods, simple and complex ones. Simple goods are produced using input materials and fuels with zero embedded emissions, meaning that the embedded emissions of simple CBAM goods are based entirely on the emissions occurring during their production. However, for complex goods, it is necessary to include the embedded emissions of relevant precursors themselves in the scope of CBAM, if used in the production process. Relevant precursor materials refer to those raw materials used in the production of complex CBAM goods that are CBAM goods themselves. In the cement sector, a typical example for a precursor is cement clinker, which is the main constituent of Portland cement. These three emission types, direct, indirect, and precursor, together form the CBAM embedded emissions, which are to be reported for each CBAM good entering the EU territory. Next slide, please. All right. Here we touch upon the EU methodology, which is a method of calculating direct emissions. It will become a default way of determining emissions in the definitive period. It is comprised of two approaches, calculation-based and the measurement-based approaches. The choice between the two, or a combination of both, should favor a method that gives the most accurate and reliable results, except where sector-specific requirements require the use of a particular method. Under the calculation-based approach, emissions may be determined by the standard or mass balance method. Under the standard method, emissions are calculated on the basis of quantities of all consumed fuels and inputs multiplied by corresponding factors, notably the emission factor, the conversion factor, and the oxidation factor. Under this scenario, it is necessary to measure emissions from fuel combustion as well as emissions from the production process. Under the mass balance approach, considering there's no differentiation between fuel and process materials is made. Emissions are calculated on the basis of carbon content of each material entering the installation as an input and leaving it as an output. Emissions are difficult of calculating. Emissions of individual inputs are determined as the difference between the input and output carbon content. Mass balance method is typically relevant where carbon remains in the goods produced. It is also possible to use a combination of the mass balance method and the standard method for the different parts of the installation. The measurement-based approach requires the use of the so-called continuous emission measurement system installed at a suitable measurement point, for example, in the stack. The system requires the measurement of greenhouse gas concentration and volumetric flow of the gas stream where the measurement takes place. The system refers to the total equipment necessary for the determination of a gas or particulate matter concentration or emission rate using pollutant analyzer measurements and a conversion equation, graph, or computer program to produce results in units of the applicable emission limitation or standard. This system determines the actual emissions. Next slide, please. Next, let's move on to the CBAM authorities and technical roles. Next. Let's start this section with the relevant authorities and their responsibilities. The main CBAM authorities are the European Commission, custom authorities, and national competent authorities. The Commission has a central role in administration of CBAM. The Commission will set the overall framework, rules, and guidelines in cooperation with the Member State and the Parliament. The Commission is responsible for methodology development and manages the CBAM transitional registry, where CBAM reports are submitted. Starting from 2026, the Commission computes the price of CBAM certificates and publishes the average price on its website. Customs authorities are entitled to carry out checks on the goods imported and ensure that the person importing the goods is an authorized CBAM declarant. Customs authorities also inform the importers of their obligations. Each EU member state has an important role in implementing CBAM. During the transitional period, the national competent authorities grant accesses to the CBAM transitional registry, where CBAM reports are submitted. From 2025, competent authorities will be responsible for granting the authorized CBAM declarant status. From 2026, they will oversee the purchase and surrender of CBAM certificates and are also obliged to repurchase excess CBAM certificates upon request by a declarant. Competent authorities will ensure the enforcement of the CBAM obligation and work with the Commission to ensure consistent implementation of the regulation across the EU. Next slide, please. All right, this slide gives a list of links leading to the websites of the relevant national competent authorities in each member state. It is not always the same authority, like for example, Ministry of Environment in every member state. The authorities vary from customs to different agencies and ministries. Next one, please. Next, let's consider the possible technical roles businesses can have. This and the next slide gives a brief overview of the key technical roles and the related responsibilities in the transitional and definitive period. We will focus on the importers and producers compliance later with more detail. Let's start with the transitional period. First key and the most important role is reporting declarant. The reporting declarant is the entity which is responsible for the reporting of embedded emissions of imported goods. In principle, the reporting declarant is the importer. However, in practice, there are different options depending on the person lodging the customs declaration. So, the reporting declarant can be 1. The importer who lodges a customs declaration for release of goods in its own name and on its own behalf. 2. The person holding an authorization to lodge a customs declaration and who declares the importation of goods. 3. The indirect customs representative, when the importer is established outside the Union or where the indirect customs representative has agreed to the reporting obligations. Reporting declarant's key responsibilities are to request the relevant data on specific embedded emissions of the imported CBAM goods from the operators and provide a CBAM report on a quarterly basis. The second key role is operator of an installation producing CBAM goods outside the EU. Installation operators are the persons who have direct access to information on the emissions of their installations. They are therefore responsible for monitoring and reporting the embedded emissions of goods they have produced and are exporting to the EU. Last role is third-party verifiers. They will play an important role in the definite period, but during the transitional period, verification is a fully voluntary measure which operators of installations may choose as a means to improve their data quality and to prepare for the requirements of the definitive period. Therefore, there is no official CBAM-related responsibility yet, as the verification is only voluntary at this point. Next slide, please. Let's move on to the definitive period. To achieve the status of authorized CBAM declarant, reporting declarants must apply it from the national competent authority in the member state where the applicant is established. From 1st of January 26, only authorized CBAM declarants will be able to import CBAM goods into the European Union. As for responsibilities in the definitive period, authorized CBAM declarant must submit a verified yearly CBAM declaration and purchase and surrender CBAM certificates. The role and responsibility of the operator of an installation producing CBAM goods outside the EU remains the same as in the transitional period. They have the key information on the emissions, and they need to monitor and report it for the CBAM goods exported to the EU. Accredited verifiers must be external and independent. The status will be granted to verifiers accredited under the EU ETS and also for the CBAM purposes. The accreditation of CBAM verifiers will be the task of national accreditation bodies, NABs, in the EU member states. The accreditation will follow specific rules which will be defined by the Commission. During the definitive period, their responsibility is to verify declared embedded emissions in the CBAM declarations. They will prepare a verification report which will be attached to the CBAM declarations. Next slide, please. Let's move on to the next sections where I explain the main obligations for two main roles in the supply chain. Next one. As evident already, there are two main roles. Those are importer in the EU and non-EU producer. Next two slides presents obligations for both roles which need to be fulfilled in order to be CBAM compliant. In short, importer in the EU submits information which is monitored and reported by non-EU producer to authorities who in turn, if needed, impose possible sanctions on the importer. Next one, please. Let's start with the obligations of EU importer. First, the obligations during the transitional period are presented on the left-hand side of the slide. During this period, the CBAM will apply as a reporting obligation. Importers of CBAM goods are required to submit to the European Commission quarterly CBAM report. The CBAM report should include the total quantity of each type of CBAM good imported during that quarter, the actual total embedded emissions, the total indirect emissions, the carbon price due in a country of origin, where the embedded emissions in the imported goods. Importers must request this data on embedded emissions of the imported CBAM goods from the operators. During the transitional period, the data is not required to be verified. To be noted that a failure to submit or correct a CBAM report will result in penalties, following a correction procedure by the competent authority of the member state where the importer is established. Sanctions and penalties were presented in more detail on the previous webinar, which can be found on our YouTube channel. In preparation for the full implementation of the CBAM, starting from 1st of January 2025, importers will need to apply for the status of authorized CBAM declarant from the competent authority in the member state where they are established. Next, the obligations during the definitive period on the right-hand side of the slide. In the definitive period, EU importers must submit through the EU-wide CBAM registry a yearly CBAM declaration by 21st of May each year, specifying 1. The total quantity of each type of CBAM goods imported during the previous calendar year. 2. The total embedded emissions in those goods. 3. The total number of CBAM certificates to be surrendered corresponding to the total embedded emissions after the adjustment to reflect the free emission allowances allocated under the EU ETS. And 4. A copy of the verification report of the embedded emissions issued by the accredited verifier. Where a carbon price has been effectively paid in the country of origin, authorized CBAM declarants will be able to claim in their CBAM declaration a reduction in the number of CBAM certificates to be surrendered, taking into account any relevant rebates or other form of compensation applied in relation to the carbon price paid in the country of origin. Importers must request the relevant data from the operators and have a record of data required for calculating emission details and store it for 5 years. Importers must ensure that the total embedded emissions declared in the CBAM declaration are verified by an accredited verifier. Importers must purchase CBAM certificates through a common central platform from the competent authority of the member state where they are established. The price of the certificates will correspond to the weekly average price of the auctioned EU ETS allowances. Importers must surrender CBAM certificates through the CBAM registry corresponding to the embedded emissions declared for the previous calendar year in the yearly CBAM declaration as verified by an accredited verifier. Next slide, please. This slide summarizes the obligations of a non-EU producer. As mentioned earlier, producers of CBAM goods outside the EU have direct access to information on the emissions of their installation. They are therefore responsible for monitoring and reporting the emissions of goods they have produced and are exporting to the EU. The first element is the monitoring of direct emissions of the installation. However, it is only the initial part of determining the embedded emission of a product. Whenever an installation produces several different products, the emissions must also be appropriately attributed to the individual products. Due to the specific rules for attributing emissions to goods, there is also a need to determine the example, for example, certain flows of heat and to and from the installation and between relevant production processes. Non-EU producer must also monitor and report to the reporting declarants the quantities of relevant precursors used in the manufacturing process and determine the embedded emissions of these precursors. Actually, as explained earlier, precursors are specific input materials which themselves are CBAM goods and have embedded emissions. Indirect emissions released from the generation of the electricity consumed during the production of all CBAM goods similarly must be monitored for the purposes of the CBAM and attributed to the goods produced. Again, emissions embedded in precursors must be included where relevant. Finally, producers must communicate to the importers the carbon price due in the production of the good within its own jurisdiction. This includes the carbon price per ton, CO2, and the amount of reallocation or any other financial support relevant for the CBAM. Notably, in case of complex goods, the carbon cost due to the producer of precursor materials should also be taken into account. And to be highlighted, during the transitional period, indirect emissions of all CBAM goods are to be monitored and reported, including the embedded indirect emissions of precursors. However, in the definitive period, indirect emissions will be included only for certain products. And for more information, please go and see Annex 2 to the regulation. Next slide, please. And let's conclude the webinar. Next slide. The webinar can be summarized to 3 take-home messages. First, CBAM is an environmental policy measure which complements the EU ETS and addresses carbon leakage. And 2, the entire settings are quite complex because there are plenty of stakeholders, different roles, and implications per role and sectors. 3, the obligations have major implications for EU importers and non-EU producers. It is therefore recommended to review and scope the monitoring and reporting practices within the relevant supply chain. And now we have reached the end of my part, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Tero. Okay, and of course, keep in mind that we also are happily providing CBAM related support services for clients who need those at this fairly early stage, but still, as Tero mentioned, preparing for this very complicated requirements is something that will take time. So starting early is the key. Okay, so let's go to the Q&A part, and let's cover first some of the pre-submitted questions. So you're, Tero, not quite off the hook yet, as you will have to answer these, and then we'll take some questions from the chat, which I see blinking there. I haven't seen the questions yet, but we'll come back to that in just a second. So we had 5, well, more, but we consolidated the questions into 5 main topic questions. I guess I can take the first one, but just let me read those out, and then I'll ask you, Tero, to answer these starting from question 2. So the first one, just missed the first webinar in the series. Is there a slide deck or recording available? So recording is available, as mentioned many times, on our REACHLaw Talks YouTube channel. Generally, we do not distribute the slide deck, but you should be able to easily read the deck through the recording. And of course, in YouTube, you're welcome to always pause the video if you want to take screenshots or whatever. So you have full control in YouTube. So go to YouTube, our channel, to see this first recording. Okay, going to question 2, and this one is for you, Tero. We source iron, steel, aluminum from within the EU and from outside of the EU. Would like to understand obligations for both situations. Well, you covered this in the presentation, but please do reiterate briefly. Thank you, Tero.
Yes, thank you. So I believe this question was from a US-based company. So US-based companies do not have EU CBAM related obligation when sourcing from EU or outside EU. CBAM only applies when importing in the EU. However, there may be other carbon related obligation when imported in the US, imposed by the US government. Yes, that was my answer.
Very good, thank you, Tero. And going to question 3, this was covered in part 1, but let's reiterate. So the question is, what other sectors will be the next target for CBAM?
Yes, according to our understanding, the next sectors will be chemicals, polymers, paper and pulp, and some mineral oil products.
Very good. And question 4 of the pre-submitted ones. So as a producer of other chemicals that get exported to the EU, I'm interested to learn more about the likelihood and timeline that CBAM gets expanded to include most chemicals. And also, how will the taxation work for complex processes, I guess? Yeah, work.
Yes, so what can I say now? That is, we expect that chemicals will be added under CBAM between 26 and 30. So in 2 to 6 years. And regarding the taxation for complex processes, I would need some more details and therefore urge you to contact me by email.
Very good. So some task for the person asking. Very good. Okay, and last of the pre-submit questions, I would like to have a clarification on the role of importer and due calculations.
Yes, so a large part of this webinar concerned those topics, and I hope they clarified the topics for you. And if not, then please send me an email and we can discuss more.
Very good. And as I said, once this is on YouTube, you're welcome to look at the recording, and you can even speed it up or slow it down or pause to look at it in more detail. And let's go to some of the other questions in the chat. So give me just a few seconds to get those out. We're going a bit over time, but let me just take one here at least. So which chemicals will fall under the CBAM regulation? And this is, of course, a very interesting question. I see that a couple of people have asked more or less the same. So please, let's take this as the only question.
All right, so we don't really have that much details yet, but those chemicals which production is at risk of carbon leakage and where it's carbon intensive, the production. But we don't have like details on which specific chemicals yet. At least I don't have.
Okay, and well, something to follow, and I'm pretty sure, Tero, you probably can concur that we will have additional webinars as more information comes available, specifically, of course, pertaining to chemicals and so forth. But there will be more coming up. This is just the first taste of the CBAM as part of the part 1 webinar and this part 2, but there will be more. I think we can almost promise that, Tero, at this stage.
Certainly.
Yes, very good. Okay, as we are over time, let's. There were some very specific questions. We will skip those. We'll contact the people directly to answer those questions, as I don't think they will benefit the rest of the audience. So what we'll do, we'll conclude this webinar here, and of course, extend a huge thank you for attending this webinar and your attention. And I hope you got more information on CBAM and got to digest and understand what it means and how you can prepare. And please do feel free to contact Tero and of course me on any questions you may have pertaining to CBAM, and if you, for example, need any support with understanding your obligations and so forth, as we have that as services already for companies who are in those situations. So feel free to reach out, and of course, thank you to Tero for being the subject matter expert, for providing the presentation, and of course to other colleagues who are helping set and have this webinar. So Ingrid, kudos to you. And with that, we will thank you and conclude, and I wish you a very good day and stay safe.
Thank you.